The Uncharted series is fondly remembered for the games that Naughty Dog did for the PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4, however those 5 are not the only ones bearing the Uncharted name. There is another one, or well, 2 of them, that are becoming lost to time in the grander discussion of the series. I'm of course talking about the 2012 release Uncharted Golden Abyss that released for the PlayStation Vita handheld in the year 2012. I've owned this game for years now, and I've never gotten around to playing it all the way through from start to finish, so this video is finally the chance to talk about Uncharted Golden Abyss before we dive into Uncharted 4 next week. But to talk about Uncharted Golden Abyss, we also have to talk about the PlayStation Vita, because this handheld is almost more important to the discussion of this game than the PlayStation 3 was to the Uncharted trilogy. So let's get into it. The Vita is such an interesting piece of PlayStation's history because of all Sony's hardware, it's the only one that is universally recognized as a complete flop. Yeah, I can't mince words with that. The PS Vita is cursed to forever be the least popular PlayStation console by a large margin. Which is so odd because, like I said in the Uncharted 2 video, the PlayStation and PlayStation 2 had dominated the market in their respective generations, and then even the PlayStation 3 managed to finish strong in spite of its rocky debut. But the Vita just did not land with an audience. And there are a lot of reasons you could pinpoint as to why that is. But at face value, you'd think the console would do somewhat well because it was a sequel to the PlayStation Portable. Now, the PSP is often remembered as being less popular than its competition, the Nintendo DS, which was a juggernaut in sales. However, when taken on its own, the PSP did well enough, sold 80 million units in its lifetime, which is a much bigger dent in the DS's market than, say, Sega's Game Gear had over Nintendo's Game Boy in the 90s. So PlayStation on the go was popular in the 2000s and had every right to do a successor. I remember even being excited for it when it was announced on the stage at E3 2011 because I was big on the PSP back in the 2000s. But the Vita only sold about 16 million units in its lifetime, which is not even 25% of the original. But why though? The Vita came with a plethora of features like a touchscreen on the front and on the back, 2 analog sticks for improved gameplay over the PSP, which only ever had 1, an easy to use interface, and the list goes on. The failure of the PlayStation Vita comes down to a couple of important things. One was the cost. Sony locked the price of the machine itself at $250 US, not looking to ever repeat the mistake of the early PlayStation 3. While its direct competition, the Nintendo 3DS, launched at the same price, its games were $40 at launch when some Vita games went for $30 and others for $50. Then you had its unique memory cards, which were incredibly expensive. A 32GB one cost $100. Another big thing that took a hit to the Vita was a changing market. When the PSP came out, if you wanted to play games on the go, you would have to own a handheld game console. But the smartphone changed the dynamic completely. Former president of Sony Interactive, Shuhei Yoshida, reflected on this in 2015.
Because people have mobile phones, smartphones, and it's so easy to just play games on smartphones, and most of games on smartphones are free, right? Free to start. I myself is a huge fan of PS Vita. We work really, really hard to design every aspect of PS Vita.
With cheap and easy to play mobile games being just a couple of swipes away on your phone or your iPad or whatever, why pay $250 for an extra device that does that? The 3DS struggled out of the gate for a similar reason, but bounced back with a strong game library, which is, in my opinion, the biggest reason why the Vita failed: the game library. I've mentioned before that I take pride in owning at least one version of each PlayStation console, and I was thinking recently, maybe I'll invest in some more Vita games to add to the collection, and then I realized, wait a minute. There's no games on this thing. Which is so weird because the PSP had a lot of different offerings across multiple different genres. The Vita promised PS3 quality games on the handheld, but then it didn't really deliver, punching well above its weight class by having a roster of games that try to be on par with what the PS3's games were doing, but just never had it as good, since the tech wasn't really there to make them anything more than subpar. Much of its exclusive library got mediocre scores as a result. Third-party support was also very low on the Vita, even Sega not bothering to dump a rushed Sonic exclusive on the thing, which tells you quite a lot. Today, unless you're someone who, shall we say, doesn't mind voiding the warranty, the Vita just doesn't have any appeal. You can divide much of its library, even the ones with good reviews, of which many exist, into a couple of camps. 1. Games that existed on previous console generations. Sure, it's novel having ports of old games on the go, the Sly Vita collection being the reason I even own one, but it's not a system seller by any means. 2. Games that were on other consoles at the time. Like sure, Batman was on Vita, but it was also on 3DS. Sly 4 and PlayStation All-Stars were on Vita, but they were also on PlayStation 3 and were infinitely superior on the home consoles. And 3. Exclusives that were once the best version of a game that are now available elsewhere, or exclusives that were watered-down versions of PS3 games, or some mix of those things. The Vita just had no killer apps, and I think that was the biggest thing it had going against it. But all those things combined produced a total failure. Something that was especially obvious by late 2013 when the PlayStation 4 released and restored Sony's position at the top of the gaming market. The Vita pretty much being left to dry by 2014 and 15 and was discontinued in March of 2019. So that brings me back to the subject of this video. Uncharted Golden Abyss, which was the console's big game when it first released. As established earlier, this was not the work of Naughty Dog, but rather Bend Studio, famous for the Siphon Filter series and released Days Gone just a few years back. But they had two Uncharted games under their belt as well, the first being Golden Abyss, obviously, and the other is Uncharted Fight for Fortune, which involves cards and stats, and I give up after 90 seconds. I have no idea what this is, but I did mention it. But seriously though, Golden Abyss actually started development before Uncharted 2 was released and the franchise became a household name. The PSP2 dev kits were out years in advance, as the whole thing having 6-axis features with a front and rear touchpad was settled on pretty early. Sony was evidently more open with developers in the PS Vita hardware than they were on prior machines. The team had to navigate hardware that was a lot different than what they were used to, crafting a narrative experience more in-depth than what they'd done before, working with Naughty Dog to make sure the story felt in line with the Uncharted franchise, and to ensure they weren't trampling on what had come before and what was going to come after, and had to do so on a timeline that required the game to release alongside the console. How this all went is something we can get into as we go along, but I'm just saying up front that it was a large task to accomplish, which luckily did pay off critically as Golden Abyss got good press back when it released in 2012. However, today, the game is pretty obscure. There was a chance to make this game a more mainstream installment when Bluepoint Games did the remasters for the Uncharted trilogy back in 2015. The decision was made to leave Golden Abyss out and just focus on the PS3 games. I can see why they did this, since retooling the game for PS4 would have been much different from fixing up 3 PS3 games, and with it already being an obscure entry, it wouldn't have even added much value to the package for consumers who largely don't even know it existed at that point. But probably would have ratcheted up the development costs unnecessarily. So Golden Abyss was left behind in the PS Vita, and it's there that the game is probably going to stay forever. If you try playing it today, you have a couple of options. First is just playing it on a real Vita, which I have sampled in the past, but that's not the most ideal way to get footage of it. The other is with the PlayStation TV device. This is a console version of the Vita that you plug into a TV with the HDMI and can then control it with the DualShock 3 or 4. But this device was also a flop because of the fact that now you just have a home console that plays largely watered down console games. But then it also doesn't even run most of the Vita library. Many Vita games are blocked because they use touchpad gimmicks. Developers would either have to have patched them out or just have the game not be playable on the PS TV at all. But why am I bringing this up? Well, warranty voiders found a way to play all the blacklisted games, which is how I knew I'd be playing Uncharted Golden Abyss once I finally got around to doing an Uncharted retrospective. However, another problem crops up in that this game is heavy on touchpad features. The DualShock 4 has a mode to emulate the front and back touchpad, but for some reason not the gyro of the Vita. So some segments are unplayable, like this rushing water part. But through a long process, you can set it up to where the DualShock 4's gyro becomes compatible with the games on the PlayStation TV, and bam, I was in business. I feel like they could have avoided this issue by letting players use the Vita itself as a controller, since it uses the same USB connection as the DualShock 4. It could have been like the Wii U with the tablet screen gameplay, but no, that's not a thing. I'm just lucky I own one of these things. I mean, I picked this up used in 2016 for $30, but apparently now they're much more expensive. But with all that preamble out of the way, this video finally gave me the chance to check out Uncharted Golden Abyss, a game I've been curious about for years now. So how was it? And should you play it? Glad you asked. Let's talk about it. Golden Abyss begins like Uncharted 2 in that the first couple minutes of the game take place towards the end. Drake explores some temple grounds and gets blasted with an RPG, then sending us back 2 weeks to see how this story began. Although apparently it wasn't supposed to open like that originally. The tutorial of this game is just chapter 27, which was also the demo of the game. They plopped it into the opening because it was a more exciting intro than the actual opening walking and exploring segment, which was for the best if you ask me. The first 2 chapters go on for what feels like forever, but when you have an exciting hook, it's a lot easier to get through. Imagine if Uncharted 1 opened in chapter 2 instead of the boat sequence is basically what this would have been like. Speaking of that game, Golden Abyss is actually a prequel to Drake's Fortune, where he explores alongside an old friend, Jason Dante, looking for Quivera, an ancient city in Panama currently occupied by the ruthless General Guerrero. Dante is working for Guerrero to the dismay of Drake and the archaeologist Marissa Chase that Dante was also working with. Nate and Chase work together for most of the runtime to get to the treasure before Dante and Guerrero, setting up the journey of Golden Abyss. This game is an interesting tech demo for the PlayStation Vita. Just looking at the game, you can clearly see this is Uncharted. The visual presentation emulating the PS3 games is what the critics were most positive on with this game. The models and areas look like something you could get on PS3, only heavily downgraded. The lighting and visuals being the most impressive part of the experience. The light coming from the sun, the shadows, and the water especially look great by Vita standards, and I'd say they still look good now on their own merits. In other areas, you can see the Vita was limited in its ability to be like the PS3, and that it had to use Windows 7 screensaver-looking backgrounds to fill the void, and how the frame rate is not good in this. The PS3 games on their original hardware were all 30 FPS, but pretty consistent throughout. This game frequently drops below that when action is going on. Performance being one of the major areas that the Vita failed at across the board, as so many games trying to be current-gen console quality would have issues with running at a stable frame rate, while also running at a lower resolution than any console was doing at the time at 544p. Now that's still more than double what the 3DS resolution was, but again you can see the issue here with competing appeals on the Vita. It's higher res than the competition, but doesn't have games that are as good, trying to reach the resolution and quality of console games that are simply better at it. Golden Abyss also suffers from being one of those extremely gimmicky launch titles. The Vita's front and back touchpads were the gimmick of the console, and the devs did not waste one opportunity to use it. This might be one of the most gimmicky games I've played in a while. When punching enemies, you'll have to swipe the screen for dodges and counterattacks. The game introduces this charcoal rubbing system where you draw on the screen with the front touchpad. RE-styled item examinations where you use the back touchpad to twist and turn the objects and the front touchpad to clean them off. Puzzles where you spin the pieces around to find the right spot. Door puzzles where you swipe up and down and left and right until you find the solution. Drag and drop puzzles, gyro-tilted balance beams, gyro-controlled ropes, swipe-controlled grenades, swipe up to zoom in with a sniper rifle and down to zoom out. Swiping allows you to draw a path for Nate to platform on without any button presses, and a full canoe section where you swipe back and forth to move and use gyro to steer. Seriously, this game has you swipe harder than a dating app. It was my guess that Sony had really strong-armed the developers in implementing as many Vita gimmicks as possible, but there's where I'd be wrong. Upon digging into it, that did not happen. Bend Studio had the attitude of, if we aren't using the Vita's features as much as possible, why are we doing an Uncharted Vita game? And thus put in swiping and gyro as often as possible. They didn't even consider it gimmicky like many critics and fans did, since they wanted to use the Vita's features in fun ways, but across the board, critics did not care for how often this game used swiping the screen as a mechanic, considering it a major pace breaker. And to the studio's point about fun hardware utilization, personally, I just didn't think it was fun. It just felt like pace-breaking ways to do the same things that were infinitely simpler on PlayStation 3. The gimmicky nature of the game is actually worse when playing it now than it would have been had I tried it alongside the critics and fans in 2012, because with the benefit of hindsight, you see these features never caught on and are just gimmicks that take away from the core formula. But on that note, besides the new motion gimmick, it's Uncharted on Vita. It's got everything you'd expect, like climbing and jumping and punching in puzzles, finding treasures and carrying 2 guns at a time with grenades and all that stuff. It's got every major staple of the Uncharted series as you go from platforming to shootouts to those two things being mixed together. The game deserves props for taking the formula of Uncharted and making a full, fleshed-out entry of the series in the handheld. This is what made the game appealing back in 2012. It was a major leap for handheld gaming. The PSP largely being able to do faithful downgrades of PS2 games, and now the Vita could, mechanically at least, replicate PS3 content. There are obviously things in this game I didn't like, such as how slow it was to punch enemies, or how the level design had reverted back to Uncharted 1's philosophy of separate combat and platforming areas, thus making both a lot more bland and making the platforming feel more drawn out than it needs to be. But again, it is Uncharted on the go, and that's pretty cool in 2012. But that's where you get the biggest issue with games like Golden Abyss. Now that handheld technology has evolved to where the Nintendo Switch and the Steam Deck can actually do full console quality games both at home and on the go, what's the appeal of this? Many handheld games that were great for their time suffer this fate of having little appeal in the replay compared to the console games because its main feature, being a version of Uncharted for weaker hardware, isn't that impressive anymore. The game was basically destined to be the worst Uncharted game by default because it's the only one with the janky frame rate and over-reliance on dull gimmicks as its main driving force. Issues the game ran into at the time, like performance, or some issues I ran into, like sometimes not being able to see what was going on properly during combat due to the smaller screen and resolution, or how I was trying to aim with the sticks while gyros also at play messing with my aim, were all things you could ignore for the sheer spectacle of playing Uncharted on the go. But as I've said a couple times now, that only really works when the game is new. It just doesn't age that well compared to replaying the main series installments. I suppose this could have been counteracted with unique level set pieces that the console games didn't have, but on that front, I felt like the game had a tendency to overuse turret sections in basic chase scenes, so it never reaches the heights of excitement that you get in Uncharted 2 or 3 either. The story is also very skippable. I think that's part of why it's a prequel to the first game. It safely allows the game to occupy a spot in the timeline where nothing of consequence really happens. Nate's most important adventures are the numbered entries. We know as early as Uncharted 1 that he's gone on plenty of jobs prior to the El Dorado incident, but none of them are important to his character, and this would be Exhibit A. When reading about this game's production history, you learn a lot of interesting stuff, like how early on, a lot of ideas were being pitched, but things kept changing thanks to feedback from Naughty Dog on how to ensure the game was in line with the series they made. Things like the story revolving around some kind of real-life lost treasure that would make for an interesting video game level are all things that Amy Hennig had workshopped with the team behind the game. They locked in the core story elements early in development to make sure they could keep a consistent production schedule and have the game out on time. Regardless of whatever rewrites they'd have to do or segments they'd add, as long as the core structure of the story stayed the same, they were in relatively good shape. I say relatively because the crunch on this game throughout 2011 to meet the launch title deadline was massive. Developers giving up weekends and holidays to finish the game and catering dinners at the office often to maximize home time. All the usual crunched dev time issues. But when looking at the writing of the final product, I don't think it's bad at all. It's a well-structured and paced story with some funny lines that are typical for the Uncharted series.
I don't need Sully. Sully, I need you.
I respect how much effort went into making this story, like how they said it was difficult to balance Chase's character. Amy Hennig had warned them that writing female characters in this genre was hard because you couldn't make them too forceful or the target male audience won't like her, and then you can't make her too useless either or the target male audience won't like her. Something the developers had trouble with in focus testing because originally Chase was going to be much snarkier, but they pulled back on it for the final release. But once more, that effort is largely lost to time in a game that story is fated to be forgotten. Many plot beats in this game feel like retreads of things that happened in previous games, like Guerrero killing his own men as a display of power just like in Uncharted 2, or Dante betraying Drake and Chase but later having to team up with you for a bit. Now I get it, the Uncharted games aren't the most original storylines of all time, they often rely on genre tropes and cliches too, but now this is a game that's doing moments that feel reminiscent of moments earlier in the series. Dante and Guerrero die in this, Chase never appears again in the series, Sully breaks an ankle but is obviously fine in Uncharted 1, so nothing really matters here, so even the story isn't a driving force this game has when considering a replay. Although credit where it's due, I feel like Sully gets more screen time in this than he did in the second game, and that's never a bad thing, he's still the best character in the game. The production value in the cutscenes is high in this, ND letting Ben Studio use their motion capture stage to film their scenes, which was nice. And then seeing cutscenes of this quality on the Vita was once again impressive for its time but no longer holds that weight. So on the matter of the writing, I thought it was good, just nothing super special. Which is kind of a shame because the game started feeling pretty long by the end. Golden Abyss has 34 chapters, the most of any Uncharted game. That's thanks to the fact that some of them are 10 to 20 minutes and others are 5 minutes or less. But still, the runtime for me was about 8 hours, which is longer than it took me to beat Drake's Fortune a few weeks back. Now this was my first full playthrough of this game, and that was not my first time with Uncharted 1, but still. I do think the game overstayed its welcome by the end, which made it extra surprising to learn that it was going to be longer. The canoe section was supposed to be more mechanically in-depth, but then was greatly cut back. And then this part that took me like 25 minutes where you search around this room for some statues to do the charcoal thing was actually way more difficult than earlier builds since the room was much darker and more difficult to navigate. But they brightened it up with extra open ceilings when playtesters would get stuck here for long stretches of time. They admitted they were perhaps overly ambitious with the scope of this game. My experience with the endgame was especially tainted by playing it with a DualShock 4. The controller's touchpad was not meant for quick on-the-fly responses, so the 2 QTE boss fights were a nightmare. You have 3 strikes before a game over, and I was on this first one with Dante for like 30 minutes because of that DS4 touchpad, when if I was playing on a real Vita, I imagine I would have gotten it first try because it's easier to react quicker when you just have to swipe a screen, not press down and then swipe on a tiny surface area. Barring that, I was still pretty ready for this game to be done by the time I was at this point. It ends with the major villains defeated, the treasure left behind, and the heroes getting away in typical Uncharted fashion. Where I was left thinking, Uncharted Golden Abyss is not a bad game. It doesn't sound like I have that many great things to say about it, but that's merely because of the fact that it achieves exactly what it set out to do. It wanted to do an authentic Uncharted game for the Vita. To that end, it succeeded. It has the gameplay, it has the same kind of structure and pacing, narrative devices, cutscene quality, music, and with features that belong on the Vita. However, when playing it for the first time in 2023, the shine on it isn't there anymore, which is a fate met by many flagship handheld titles. So Golden Abyss isn't alone in that. It's novel if you have access to a Vita, it can be enjoyed, but I would definitely not recommend tracking down a Vita for this game as it's Uncharted, but not as good. Even if I have a lot of respect for the care and time it took to make this game. I highlighted a lot of that stuff because of the fact that I feel like every game has a really interesting story behind it, and reading up on the history of this one made me really interested in the title even if the game itself wasn't really doing that much for me. But in the end, I think this game as the Vita's flagship title shows off many of its biggest issues that I stated earlier. Its major innovations being the things that made it destined to age rapidly compared to the games it sought to be like. I can't say I'm particularly surprised by this outcome. I mean, Uncharted Golden Abyss is an interesting, albeit imperfect, time. It's an interesting time capsule into the PlayStation Vita and what it was trying to do, and why maybe it didn't work out so well. But that's basically all we've got for this one. So next time we're going to finally get to the big one, Uncharted 4, A Thief's End for the PlayStation 4, which released for the first time in 2016. And I am really excited for this one because I have not played it since launch, but I remember loving it when it came out. So we're going to dive into that, and it's going to come out next week, as always. So until that time, I'll say what I always do. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you next time.